With his own diary tapes and other unique recordings, former Cabinet Minister Tony Benn recalls the crisis following a strike at the Windscale nuclear complex in 1977.
In early 77, there was a strike at Windscale in Cumbria when the management had simply refused to respond to a number of complaints about working conditions, including, I might add, the safety of people dealing with clothing that had been in radioactive areas. The union leaders refused to recognise the strike because of pay policy, and it dragged on for 6 weeks. And of course, Windscale, to keep going and keep it safe, had to have regular supplies of CO2 gas and nitrogen, otherwise the plutonium there might ignite and cause a fire, very serious consequences. So when the strike went on and on, I was told, oh, you'll have to send in troops. Well, I wasn't going to send in troops if I could avoid it. I mean, obviously I had an ultimate responsibility for nuclear safety, but it seemed to me they were trying to make me use troops in order to deal with an industrial dispute. But to begin with, what was really interesting for me at any rate was that there was a meeting of the Civil Contingencies Unit, which I'd never attended before, and this is the heart of government in a crisis. And the Home Secretary, Merlin Rees, was in the chair, and Albert Booth, the Employment Secretary, was there, and I was the Energy Secretary, and I had to go to them to discuss the crisis and how it should be handled.
Monday, the 7th of March, 1977, at 3:15 I had a meeting of the Civil Contingencies Unit, which is a meeting of officials under the chairmanship of the Home Secretary. Now, it's a committee I've never attended before. It's a very important committee, in my opinion, because I think there you are actually meeting the men who would run Britain in the event of a breakdown of law and order, a general strike, and I'm very, very pleased I've seen it. Normally it's the Home Secretary with all these officials from the Home Office and the Ministry of Defence, no doubt from the Security Services and so on. I looked round the table. I just saw these hard-faced regional controllers or national controllers, at very high level, Deputy Secretary level, I should think. The Ministry of Defence were there because it was necessary to consider the possibility of using troops, and Albert Booth was there because I'd asked the Prime Minister about it. I was asked to report briefly, and I described roughly what had happened. Albert then said that he hoped we could avoid taking action, because I felt that he felt that it would be might escalate it. And then Merlin said to me, well, what about, is there anything other than using troops? Because he said, I know what the Ministry of Defence are going to say. They don't want to be involved. Well, then Merlin said to me, well, you did mention to the Prime Minister you might go out. Well, I said, I'm not looking for a job. But I must say, if it were possible to settle it without sending troops, I'd be very pleased, because it's not the sort of thing you want to do. And everybody agreed about that.
The Windscale workers were more determined than ever today to hold out for their demands. The pickets are staying on duty at the gates to ensure no vital supplies enter until they know the result of the talks. If the negotiations fail, government safety inspectors fear that without those supplies, a rapid and dangerous deterioration of the plant is inevitable.
Well, then we had a great discussion about the deadline, because, of course, one of my worries was the nitrogen. And if this nitrogen is not used, the plutonium will ignite and start a fire, will burn through the gloves. The plutonium will then come into the clean area, and then you would have a very difficult and unpleasant job. Then the question of keeping in step with the trade union leaders, with Len Murray and Jack Jones and David Basnett and so on, was all discussed. And also this question of the shop stewards being persuaded to let the emergency supplies in, how to separate the safety issue from the industrial dispute. But I must say, my feeling about the meeting, and again it just came through my pores more than anything else, was that the idea to these important and powerful bureaucrats, the idea that you had to go on your knees to the pickets, or that you had to get Len Murray to guide the government in maintaining law and order, was deeply offensive to them. I mean, in a sense, just saying it made them feel that power had already shifted. We discussed a little bit further, and it was agreed we could leave it till tomorrow, and the Civil Contingencies Committee was going to meet tomorrow, but I heard later it was postponed until Wednesday. It is an extremely worrying and difficult issue. I'm sure the men are extremely responsible. They must not be conned under any circumstances. They must be told the truth. They will know about the deadline. They will know what the risk is. On the other hand, this is the thing they're clinging on in order to preserve their own standing in the industrial dispute. So that's the end of Monday the 7th of March.
In a situation like this, which really did constitute a bit of crisis management, you have to depend on your own judgment, and you also are very dependent on the advice you get. And I soon realized, to my horror, that the advice I was getting came from people who really had no idea of the true state of events, which meant that the deadline, the safety deadline, kept bumping backwards and forwards and made it exceptionally difficult, because I had no intention whatever of bringing in the troops unless there was the potentiality of a major fire at Windscale.
Tuesday, the 8th of March. I went over to the House of Commons, and I heard that David Basnett and Jack Biggin had arrived, and we went to my room, and David had about 4 whiskies. And what came out was a number of things. First of all, that the deadlines were wrong, that I'd been misled, that Basnett had been misled. It had destroyed both our credibilities, and it was all due to the management at BNFL, who, quite frankly, in cahoots with the department, were trying to get me to use the safety argument too early, and then to take troops in. And it was partly panic and partly mischief, really. They thought, oh, well, why bother to tell the Secretary of State? Because he'll do what we tell him anyway. And of course, now that I know they've misled me, I'm simply hopping mad. And David Basnett was furious about it, because of course the shop stewards knew better than anybody else. And in fact, there were extra reserve supplies at Windscale, and the management never disclosed them to me. So in the absence of candour, I just don't trust them. So I said to David, well, look, you'll have to get it all sorted out by Sunday. After that, it'll have to be understood I have to take the necessary action, and I'm at your disposal if I can help you. Thursday, the 10th of March, at about 12 o'clock, or soon afterwards, I had Mr. Gorston, the chief nuclear inspector, come to see me. And what he said was really sensational. He said that the nitrogen supplies, which we thought would not run out at the very latest till Wednesday of next week, giving me till Monday to act, to bring the army in, would in fact run out in terms of liquid supplies tonight at midnight, and on Sunday night even with the bottles, because he wasn't sure how much gas was in the bottles. And therefore he couldn't guarantee there wouldn't be a fire sometime after Saturday night. So I then asked Gorston to give me a note on the deadlines, and I got a note this time saying that the supplies would not be exhausted till Sunday night, so the deadlines had extended a day, and they go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. So I called him in, and he said, well, we think there's a bit more in the bottles than we thought. So in fact, I've got an extra day, which is quite convenient. Means that the army won't have to rush in so quickly.
It was absolutely clear that I had to go to Windscale. I had a very discouraging telegram from Callaghan, the Prime Minister in Washington, saying don't overreact. But there was no alternative, because the situation was getting worse and worse, and I was being pushed into action I didn't want to take. So I decided I would fly to Windscale myself. Went into a local hotel and saw Sir John Hill, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Authority, and Con Allday of British Nuclear Fuels, to try and get some sort of negotiation with the workforce. And that night in the Waverley Hotel, I recorded my feelings about what I was up against.
It may be the men would rather be ridden over by the army than give way and allow the safety deliveries. And I absolutely understand what they feel. I mean, they're hungry, they're almost in submission. They'd rather be trodden over than give way. And so it may be that what I do will not succeed. And I have a very strong interest in not sending in the troops. And they know that. Because it would do damage to the trade unions, it would do damage to me, it would do damage to them, because it would highlight the danger of a nuclear plant and might well kill Windscale as a reprocessing centre. And secondly, it would, of course, indicate the civil liberties risks of nuclear power. So we're all in a mess, and the question is, can we together get out of it? And of course, I can't offer more money, but the conciliation would have to be real. But I feel very calm and experienced in these circumstances, and I think I understand what's going to be said to me, and I'm looking forward to it tomorrow. We agreed exactly how we'd handle tomorrow, and about midnight I came up to my room, listened to the 12 o'clock news. The Daily Express have got the story that I'm in Windscale, and they're going to send somebody tomorrow. And it's now about 10 to 1, and I'm just going to bed because I'm very tired. So that is the end of Thursday, the 10th of March. I'm at the Waverley Hotel, Whitehaven.
The strikers seem both surprised and encouraged by Mr. Benn's sudden personal intervention. The minister seemed equally surprised at the bitterness that's arisen during the 6-week dispute. As he spent the day shuttling between meetings with management and unions, Mr. Benn clearly had two major concerns in mind: the growing safety risks and next Wednesday's Commons debate on Windscale's expansion plans, which could now be in jeopardy.
Will you leave it to your own representatives?
Benn admitted he'd underestimated the problems, and although some strikers still weren't happy, the minister was obviously relieved he'd managed to get negotiations resumed.
Well, in the end, the negotiations, which were exceptionally difficult, did bring about a return to work, and the crisis was over by the Sunday night. Mind you, there were repercussions later because I was blamed for the following 2 years for having broken the pay policy, but still, they had a case. And I saw Con Alder and Sir John Hill at the very end to discuss it. And what was really interesting was that here was an occasion where government really had to concede the legitimate claims of workers. They often concede to bankers and all that, and it was bitterly resented. And of course it increased my doubts about nuclear power, because if an industrial dispute of a kind that might occur in any factory could lead to an accident, then it did really raise the question of whether nuclear power was compatible with civil liberties and so on. What was the price we were being asked to pay in democratic rights as a result of having nuclear power? And those anxieties, of course, have much deepened over the years and led me to the view that you will have to phase out nuclear power.
The more that I'm disentangled from this whole story, the better. The fact that Bill Maxwell, the shop steward, said that it was only because they had withheld the safety supplies that they had got the extra money was both true and embarrassing. The fact that it was embarrassing didn't make it any less true, and the fact that it was true made it all the more embarrassing. But the reality is governments do give way to pressure. Look at the whole IMF story. What are we told? We're lectured all the time on the need to be realistic, and they'll have to be realistic about guys at Windscale just as we have to be realistic about the IMF. And so I feel quite strong in my own mind about the matter. No apologies to make whatever. Had a last talk to Hill and Alday, and the interesting thing about that was Hill said to me, if there's one lesson we've learned, it is that we've got to design a new plant when it's expanded so the safety question can't arise. And it was an amazing comment, really, because to the last, these scientists and engineers thought there was a technical fix that could get out of their dependence on their workforce, which they really don't like. And I said, John, you can't do that. I said, nuclear power has been recommended to me on the grounds sometimes that it gets away from dependence on the goodwill of the miners, and now look what happens. Well, he said, we'll get round that by redesign. Well, I said, will you do that? Then one of Frank Chappell's electricians will turn off a switch in Carlisle and all your computers will stop and you'll be in exactly the same position. And they still haven't got it, but I record that for interest.